Hi, Mr. Lamont and Miss A. I am interviewing my mom. Sorry, I'm only interviewing my family, but she is very well versed in this subject, so I think it'll be good. Can you tell me your job?
Yes. Hi, Stephanie Caccaro-Alleman, Soren's mom. I am a researcher at the California Child Welfare Indicators Project at UC Berkeley, and I also work at the Children's Data Network. I do research on vulnerable children impacted by child abuse and poverty, and I'm sort of an expert in administrative data. So I study a lot of policy issues, including transition age youth, which is the primary group of adolescents who end up involved in gang violence.
Awesome. All right. How does your job relate to gang violence? I guess you just said that.
I just kind of said that, but I think more specifically, I would say in the work that I do, I study a lot what are called dually system involved children who are involved in both the child welfare system and the juvenile probation system, and the crossover between those two. So that sort of gets to sort of the relationship between experiencing violence and then later being involved in violence. And also, essentially, structurally, the causes of violence against children or child abuse and neglect they're basically the same causes as youth violence or gang violence, with some slightly additional facets. So some kids go on to be commercially sexually exploited youth, some kids go into gangs, but it's all part of the same problem, which is vulnerable children who are experiencing structural inequity.
100%, yeah. What do you think are some of the causes of gang violence?
Well, I just kind of talked a little bit about them, but I guess if I had to use one word, besides inequity, that's not really, that has more to do with like the reasons this happened, but I would say how children experience their world. I would say instability, and that would be instability in family relationships, broken or fractured families, sometimes that are single parent families, sometimes not, but fractured in many ways, economically dislocated or unstable, meaning poor. That can lead to food instability, so poor nutrition. Also, housing instability, so lack of permanent housing, unstable housing, meaning moving housing quite often or being unhoused. All of these same things lead to typically unstable educational experiences, and you can be in a stable educational experience but have it be really poor because of inequities, structural inequities in funding. Also say, exposure to violence in your community. So typically children who are involved in gang violence are from low income, I would say mostly low income communities that suffer many of these issues for most of their members. And typically that's related to racism and discrimination in housing and jobs. I would also say being witness to violence in your neighborhood, being the victim of violence, being maltreated or neglected, all of those things we know from research can have really severe impacts on children's mental health. So any of these types of instabilities, there's something called ACEs, which is adverse childhood experiences. And most of these kids who are become part of gangs would score very high on an ACEs scale, meaning they have had multiple bad adverse experiences during their childhood with no way to sort of ameliorate that. They have parents who are in prison, they are victims of violence, and to get to the cause, all of these things, being vulnerable, having potentially depression or some other type of mental illness, not being well educated because of the schools you go to, essentially leads people to feel, I would say, somewhat hopeless and without having a place like school or home or anywhere to feel safe, people look for community and safety in groups. And typically for adolescents, that's a time when you're spending more time with your friends anyways and taking risks and taking chances. That's when things start to bleed over into gangs and gang violence, where there's a structure. It's pretty rigid structure. There's initiations. There are sort of leaders. And if you think about it, it's the same reason some people like join cults, right? There's like a need to feel part of something. So yeah,
100%.
that's a very long answer, but that's what I would say.
Awesome. What do you think are some of the consequences of gang violence?
Oh, well, I mean, like gang violence begets gang violence. I think all of these things that I've talked about in terms of neighborhoods and schools and families, when youth are involved in gang violence and get involved in the juvenile probation system, it just has adverse consequences for the rest of their lives. I mean, youth who end up committing crimes and are, sort of early, like have police or law enforcement involvement early in their life. We have something called the, school to prison pipeline. They're jumping right into it very early. They end up getting surveilled more often by police. So even when they're not doing something bad, the police may think they're bad. So at the point about what ends up happening is that, so the consequences are, effectively taking young people and putting them on a really not a viable path for a productive future outside of violence, because they end up disengaging from any of the structures that would help them. In addition, these neighborhoods that have all these structural inequities and have high rates of youth violence or gang violence, they end up being neighborhoods that people don't want to live in. So it's like really a chicken, and it becomes kind of a chicken and the egg problem. People don't want to invest in those communities or those neighborhoods to help ameliorate some of the structural inequities that are causing gang violence. And then gang violence, because it's there, makes people even less likely to go into those places, if that makes sense. Okay.
Why is there so much gang violence in Chicago and other big cities?
Well, it's interesting. So a lot of these inequities and the instability that I'm talking about for many, many years has been considered sort of an urban problem. Housing discrimination, transportation, food deserts, all of these things that make, and very low, high unemployment, very few educational opportunities. All of those things happen in parts of cities that don't have resources, that are sometimes cut off by highways, or, you can name all of these ways that parts of cities get isolated. But again, violence sort of in some ways begets violence, and these neighborhoods can be overwhelmed. I would say that while Chicago, LA, New York, really big cities where we hear stories about gangs and gang violence, a lot of things happen there because we hear about those gangs because often those youth become involved in violent crime, and they're part of those city statistics. But I do think that now what we are seeing nowadays, with sort of it's not a resurgence, it's always been there, but you have similarly dislocated youth, mostly young white males in rural areas, who are not necessarily joining gangs, but online they are becoming part of violent communities that are racist or anti-Semitic. Those structures, like they may have all, like economically, they may have not as many things happening in their life. They may not live in the inner city, but they may feel that same level of dislocation from their lives and the peoples in their lives because of many of these same things, which is, low levels of opportunity in their neighborhoods, poor schooling, lack of job opportunities, you name it. And so all of those same things sort of contribute. I think they just end up being, it manifests itself slightly differently. And those youth typically find online communities that are no less violent, just very different and not under the radar in the same way, most likely because of racism, since Black and brown youth are more likely to be involved in traditional gang violence.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. What role do you think police play in gang violence?
You know, it's really interesting. I mean, I think if you were to talk to police who do community policing and are involved in anti-gang work, they would say that they know their communities really well, and that they are always trying to help steer those youth away, most often youth who they've known for a long time, and steer them out of gangs. I think the draw is very strong, and the police do not necessarily have wonderful reputations in these communities because they are typically reacting with force. Money is not really being put into community policing or prevention work, which would really help these communities. It's really a Band-Aid and a very quick violent response when violence flares up. And also many of these youth likely have parents who are, some, not all, relatives, or they know of people who are incarcerated and have criminal justice involvement. And so that sense of involvement in the criminal justice system is never a positive thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Yeah. How do you think society can help end gang violence?
Well, it's interesting. I think the same way as we can end child maltreatment and neglect, diseases, mental illness, drug abuse, all of these things. It's investments in communities and proactive prevention, early intervention in families that show signs of risk, not coming in. It's really like a carrot and a stick approach. Really, like, we're very good in the United States at the stick, and not very good at the the carrot. We also, in the United States, we are a very individualistic society and not very communally oriented, and so we don't think of children in gangs, children in the inner city, really dislocated children anywhere as our children. We think of them as someone else's problem or their own problem. We love to blame the victim. So I do think we haven't really been able to solve that in 300 years. So I don't know that that's necessarily going to change, but I do think an understanding of the costs and consequences of gang violence and all of these other social problems, long term, whether it's obviously the social costs are huge, but that in the United States doesn't seem to be enough. We don't really turn our attention to them. But the economic costs, there's certainly an economic argument to be made that prevention dollars will pay off in the long run. The more you can divert children from gang violence and have them become sort of productive members of society who pay taxes and give back and obviously are not lost and hurting themselves or others, I think is a win.
Mm-hmm. 100%. Have you heard of any effective programs?
Yeah. So, most of my experience with this comes around some initiatives in Los Angeles County, around transition age youth who live on the streets. And those aren't necessarily youth who are involved always in gang violence, but I do know that one of the best approaches to helping to stop gang violence are former gang members who are reformed, who have lived experience with gangs and really understand the pressures and the draws of being initiated into a gang and what it means to a group, but then can also help youth understand what the consequences are by sharing their experiences having gone to prison or being shot or whatever it might be, that those one-on-one sort of lessons that are built out of strong relationships are really important. And so really it's a human problem. And then obviously, in addition to that, helping to solve some of these structural issues. Doing just one thing, I think holistic approaches are really important. Obviously, there's no one thing that causes gang violence. It's a system that causes it. So you really need to address it in a systematic manner.
100%. Have you ever been a victim of gang violence?
I myself have not been a victim of gang violence. I have witnessed gang violence before in New York City, seeing a car chase where a gun was involved that I later learned was sort of gang violence related, although I wasn't injured and nothing really bad happened to me. And then obviously in my work, I mostly focus on administrative data or large data sets that study these youth, but I have been part of qualitative interviews with youth who have been in gangs, and I've heard sort of firsthand from them about some of their experiences and their struggles.
Awesome. Why should people care about gang violence?
Well, I think I kind of answered that before. I guess I could maybe summarize it a little bit better since I'm being really wordy, but every child in America is an American child. That's all I can say. Every child in the world is a child of the earth. We are so segregated economically, socially, in every way, educationally, housing, and I don't think that people really understand that even though gang violence, like for instance, I, living in Marin, have never witnessed gang violence here. I'm so segregated from anyone who's involved in that. And that's part of the problem. We don't live even when we live in communities, we just don't cross over the neighborhood to the dangerous neighborhood to interact with those people. And it's that whole sense of I'm here and I'm safe, and if I go over there, I'm not safe. And in fact, we're all people from the same city, from the same geography. And so I do think more interaction is important. And the reason I say that is because I think the more personal relationships people develop with one another, with people who they wouldn't necessarily consider part of their like friend group or economic strata, or I think it's important because I think when we see children who are involved in gangs as children who are vulnerable and need our help and support, I think we're more likely to invest in good government programs, to vote in representatives who will help shepherd some of those programs into reality by funding them. I just think it's really important that we understand that kids who are involved in gang violence, they may be manifesting things with violence and being in gangs, but if you really draw back to why that this has happened, you'll understand that these are really just basically injured children, vulnerable injured children. Yeah.
100%. Awesome. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Hi, Mr. Lamont. Hi, Miss A. I'm interviewing my sister Isabel as part of my project about Chicago gang violence. Hi, Isabel. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Pretty good. My first question starts off with how long have you lived in Chicago?
I have lived in Chicago proper this is my second year here. and I've lived in the general Chicagoland area for about 6 years. I spent 4 years at college in Evanston, which is a northern suburb of Chicago, and then moved down after graduation to Chicago proper.
Awesome. All right. What part of Chicago do you live in?
I currently live on the north side of Chicago in an area called Ravenswood.
Okay. Awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel safe in the area you live in?
I feel super safe in the area that I live in. It's very, it's a city, obviously, but this part of the city feels very suburban. And I'm surrounded by a lot of really beautiful parks, and the demographic of the area is there's a lot of young families, and then a lot of people who seem to be around my age range in their like 20s, 30s. Yeah.
Awesome. Have you ever noticed any gang violence or anything in your personal area since you have moved to Chicago?
Sorry, could you repeat the question? I couldn't hear you.
Yeah. Have you noticed any like trends in gang violence in like your specific area since you moved to Chicago, or just in near you?
In my specific area, I don't know of any specific instances of gang violence. My area, the like neighborhood that I live in is not typically one of the areas in Chicago that I know of that is impacted by gang violence usually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
This is a very like affluent part of the city, and I don't know of any specific like gang communities within this area.
Mm-hmm.
I do know that like between my area and slightly further north, there is some like violent activity. The thing about it is that
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
there are lots of instances of violence in Chicago because it is the third largest city in America, and there's like 3 million people that live here.
Definitely, yeah.
But it's difficult to know if those instances of violence, for example, like a shooting at a train station near me, or robberies, or any of those things are related to gang violence, or if they are separate instances.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever seen Chicago gang violence in person? Just quick.
I don't know for sure.
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't tell you. I've witnessed and been involved in like acts of violence here, but I don't know if they were gang related or not.
Okay, sounds
It's
good.
not really usually. I feel like it's
Doesn't have to be more gang related, but it has to do with the overall amount of people that live in the city and how often crime happens. But it's not specifically in your area tied to gangs. That's what you're saying.
I'm saying that I don't know.
Yeah.
I feel like it's hard to like delineate if something is specifically like a gang violence instance.
Yeah.
If you are like outside of the situation.
Yeah, I gotcha. That makes sense. What do you think some of the problems are in Chicago that just cause kids to join gangs? Do you have any idea? That is a big question.
That is a really big question that I am personally not at all qualified to answer. And I haven't lived in Chicago long enough to know much about like the specifics of this city's infrastructure and how they contribute. That said, I know that the like investment in public education is really, really important here, and it has not been something that has been like invested in very well.
Yeah.
I would argue, especially like given the local politics. But I'm excited that Chicago just elected Mayor Brandon Johnson, who I think will be hopefully a really good thing for the CPS, Chicago Public School System. I think that there is a general lack of investment in community structures that could actually prevent violence beyond just like public school and education. I'm thinking about like aftercare programs. I'm thinking about investment in the families of these children and in the healthcare system. I think there's just so many contributing factors. And over the years, instead of driving money into community resources and communal care and public social welfare systems, instead, the Chicago Police Department's budget has just been expanding and expanding and expanding. And it has not, as far as I know, contributed to any drop in violent crime or gang activity, because I think the reasons that people are, I don't know, and I'm lucky enough to not be in a position to know, but I would suspect that the motivating force behind needing to join a gang is needing community and needing safety and needing support. And when none of those things are being provided by the environment because the local politics and the funding is instead being driven into policing people and violently ripping apart these communities rather than bringing them together, the solution and one of the only options seems to be turning to community and safety in the form of gangs.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. Thank you. That kind of tied into my other topic of what are your thoughts about Chicago's police department? Do you think they're being overfunded or?
I can't speak for what the Chicago Police Department does with gangs.
No, not just gangs,
but
but just in general. Chicago.
In general, as a victim of violent crime in Chicago, it was made exponentially worse by my experience with the Chicago Police Department on an emotional and like psychic level. I understand elements of the work that they do are in order to like catch perpetrators are necessary. But in my personal experience,
they did not
not only was the experience completely re-victimizing and traumatic to be like working as a victim with the police department, but they also didn't seem to really know what they were doing on a lot of levels, and the lack of coordination, and the lack of like ability to effectively do their jobs without causing more harm was honestly astonishing. And as a young white woman who is arguably one of the most protected people by the system of policing, it was definitely an eye-opening experience. And I can't even fathom what it would be like to be a victim working with Chicago police if I wasn't in the like gender, race, and age demographic that I am.
Oh, yeah, I gotcha. That makes sense. Thank you. You kind of answered that, but is there any aspects of, if this one doesn't make any sense to you, that's fine, but is there any aspects of the justice system in Chicago that you think need to like change? You kind of answered that saying like
Yeah, I mean, again, unfortunately, I wish I was much more well versed in
you're okay.
exactly what I could tell you, but what I can offer is that I don't think funding the police further and funding, I think as a whole, we need to completely reevaluate the institution of policing and our prison systems. I just don't think that I think they are effective, but they are not effective in the way that we actually, as a human species, need them to be.
Yeah.
I don't think that they are providing protection. I think they are providing punishment after like hurt has already happened. I don't think they're actually doing anything to prevent or bolster like
any change,
healthy human interaction in any way.
That makes sense. 100%.
I think they're
Awesome. Now 2 more questions left. These are fairly easy because we kind of already answered them. But do you think gang violence in your community has like an influence over your daily life? But you said like there's a violence in your community, but you don't think it's related to gang violence. Correct?
I'm sorry, you kind of cut out for a second. Could you ask me that again?
So do you think gang violence in your community has an influence over your daily life?
It doesn't have an influence over my daily life, specifically because of the area and community that I live in. Yeah.
Awesome. And then, is there anything else you have to say about this topic? Any other thoughts, or it's okay if you don't have it? It's all right.
I don't think so. I think it's just we need to invest in social systems of reform rather than systems of violence and punishment.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Isabel.
Of course. Thank you.